Hello everybody. Does your car crank slow and make these noises when starting the engine, especially on a cold, frigid winter day? Do these symptoms perhaps go away after the engine's warmed up? Well, the issue is more than likely the starter, and I'm going to show you how to both diagnose and replace the starter, and I'll be demonstrating it on my 2008 Acura MDX. So before we get started, we're just going to start by purchasing some tools and parts for the diagnosis process, as well as that starter that we're going to be replacing. And the first thing we're going to need is a battery charger. Specifically, we're going to need one that has at least 5 amps for charging car batteries properly. And this Noco brand is notorious for making really good battery chargers and jump starters, so I might recommend this one. Charging the battery is going to rule out whether or not we have a bad battery or alternator. And the next thing we're going to need is a multimeter to be testing the various voltages of the battery, as well as to check for the voltage drop and the alternator test. This is a highly rated one as well from a lot of reviewers, and it's less than $50. Highly recommend getting that. These alligator clips are also really good for making electrical tests a lot easier. I might recommend picking up a pack of these. And then lastly, we're gonna need a starter. Or more specifically, you have the alternate option of attempting to rebuild it, in which case, if you feel like you want to go down that route, you can get the solenoid here for about $35, as well as you can get that copper wire for about $16. However, based on the forums, I've read that attempting to rebuild these starters hasn't been all that successful. And for that matter, since these Denso starters are kind of notorious for not exceeding the life of the vehicle and failing after 200,000 miles or so, I also wouldn't recommend getting a junkyard part either. I'd recommend getting a remanufactured one. It's going to be essentially a brand new part. It's going to be guaranteed to work, and it's going to come with a 1-year warranty. I wouldn't recommend getting one from Honda because they're like $333, and it's a Denso starter, so you know you can get this from alternative sources. So we're going to come over to Rock Auto. It's about $203 plus tax and shipping. And then you can purchase a return label from Rock Auto for $8. And then once they receive the part and inspect it, you'll get a total of $68 back for a core charge return and effectively make the final price about $143 plus the initial taxes and shipping costs. So that's all the parts we're going to need. Why don't we get started? So before we just blindly replace that starter, we're going to first make a couple clarifications and rule out a couple other components. So first, when you listened to the starter noise, you'll notice that it was making the noise as the engine was cranking, but before the engine started, and then it continued to make that noise for about 1 or 2 seconds after the engine started. So, with that in mind, we're going to rule out 2 other likely components that might confuse people. The first one being the power steering pump. The power steering pump only makes noise under one condition: when air gets in the system. Air gets in the system in 2 ways. One would be due to low power steering fluid, and it would be making noise continuously for as long as you have power steering fluid, not for just 1 second. You can see I am up to the max fill mark so that we can eliminate that variable. The other reason would be due to a bad power steering inlet O-ring. And when that O-ring gets old and cold, it gets really hard and it fails to produce an airtight seal. And that allows a little bit of air to get into the system and again cause some power steering noise. However, once the engine warms up, that O-ring will warm up and soften, produce an airtight seal again, and then the noise will go away. And obviously it takes a couple minutes for the engine to warm up, and our noise is only occurring for a second or 2. So we know it is not the power steering pump. The next likely culprit that people might confuse starter noise with is the alternator. Kind of hard to see, tucked away down in there. And the alternator typically, when healthy, does not make any noise at all. If it is making noise, that means you have a bad alternator. And alternators typically make noise either due to a bad bearing or a bad internal electrical component such as those diodes, in which case those components would be making noises continuously as well for as long as the engine's running. Bearings don't just make noise for 1 second, especially at only 200 RPMs. And if those diodes are bad, those are also going to continuously make noise as they try to produce electricity and as long as the car is running. Not again for just 1 second, similar to what we're experiencing. So now that we've narrowed it down to the starter that's making the noise, the next question is, why is it making that noise? And so there are a few noises that these starters can make, and for a variety of reasons. The first one can revolve around this solenoid right here. And this solenoid has two purposes. It'll first act as an engagement mechanism, causes this gear to move forward and engage with the flywheel. And then the second one is to close the circuit with this motor and allow this gear to spin. And so the first problem is that this gear doesn't engage due to a bad solenoid. And then what will happen is you'll hear a high-pitched whining noise, which is the gear spinning, but then your engine isn't cranking. And vice versa, the other problem could be that it engages and you hear a loud click. Really strong, powerful click. But your engine doesn't crank. And that's because it's not completing the circuit to the motor and it's not getting power, and therefore your engine's not going to crank. The next thing that can be wrong is a bad circuit. And so you can see right here, this is a very important wire and it is completely green, completely corroded, very rusty. And you'll see in a second here, I do continuity tests on the solenoid and I can barely get a connection off of this thing. It's seriously that rusted. And I'd be willing to bet this is a big contributor to my problem and the fact that there's not a proper electrical circuit through this thing due to the amount of rust and corrosion right there. And that can result in not inadequate amount of power getting to the motor through the solenoid, and that too can cause slow cranking or noisy cranking, a noisy motor. Another problem can be this gear right here and the fact that it doesn't retract quickly enough. And when that happens, it'll retract, it'll spin, your engine will start, and it'll spin a lot faster than the starter's supposed to spin. And because it's not retracting quickly enough, what will happen is it'll grind up against these starter gears and it'll create a really aggressive, unpleasant scraping sound. And you definitely don't want that. That can happen due to either a weak spring, a weak magnet, or perhaps just over time these things simply get dirty and just prevent it from retracting properly. The last thing that can go wrong with these starters, again, is they can get dirty and they can just get worn out, and an improper circuit can be made. Due to all the wear and tear and rust and dirt, everything can wear down and they just become inefficient and noisy over time. So hard to say exactly what's wrong with my specific starter. Again, I'm thinking it's got to be either the motor or this corrosion right here. Looking inside, the grease definitely looks dark. So it could just be the lubrication inside is dirty and thickened, and when it gets cold, it makes it even worse. It's worn out, and that's probably what's making my noise. So I'm gonna replace this bad boy before I can't start my car anymore. And now we're gonna get to our first actual test, and that's going to revolve around the battery. And another potential reason why that starter's making noise is because it's not getting enough volts and amps. It's not getting enough power to engage the gear, spin the starter, and start the engine. And so what we're going to do to give our battery and starter the best possible scenario as far as power output goes is we're going to charge the battery. Regardless of if you drive the car every day or once a month, just a simple charge is all it takes to eliminate this factor. So we'll charge it until that light turns green. That'll indicate that we've got a 100% charged battery, and we're going to do a cold start. And if the starter continues to make that noise, then we definitely know we have a bad starter. And so I'm going to disconnect the black, disconnect the red. I'm going to get my charger out of the engine bay, and I'm going to go start the car. So it sounded like it continued to make that noise. We gave our battery and our starter the best chance possible as far as power output goes. So we definitely know that there is a problem with the starter and it needs to be replaced. Now, before we replace that starter, we're gonna go and run through the other scenario where for some of you, charging the battery might have actually made the noise go away, which would indicate that there's a problem with the battery or the alternator. Before we do any battery voltage tests, what we're gonna do is wait at least a half an hour to ensure that all the interior lights are off and that the car's computer is asleep. Because in the meantime, before the car's computer is asleep, it can draw a voltage and potentially give some false readings. I'll show you now. We'll just open up the door. And already immediately you can see that the battery voltage has dropped about 0.2 volts. So again, just let your car sit for a half an hour before you proceed. And then we're gonna simply check the voltage. We should get at least 12.6 volts. I've got a solid 12.76. Now I've got my battery hooked up to my multimeter with some alligator clips, and we're gonna test two different voltages. First is gonna be the voltage drop test and the alternator voltage test. For the voltage drop test, when you start the car, the starter draws a lot of current, and that causes the battery voltage to drop. And if it drops too low, that's a sign that you've got a weak battery and it might need to be replaced. Ideally, it should not drop below 10 volts. And then after the car is started up, the alternator is going to start doing its job, and it's going to start charging the battery and powering all the electronics in the car. And that reading after the car is started up, it should read about 14 volts. So why don't we go start the car and see what kind of voltage readings we get. So you can see the battery voltage dropped to about 9.7 volts, which is below the 10 volt limit that we're trying to achieve, but 9.7 is close enough, and quite frankly, considering that the battery is a couple of years old and has a 600 cold cranking amps rating as opposed to the OEM recommendation of 630 or higher, that makes sense. So I'm going to say it passes that test. Plus the alternator was putting out 14.3 volts, and that also passes with flying colors. So we've got no electrical problems on our end. We've got one more really simple test to do, and that is to simply let the car sit for 24 hours. And we're gonna test the voltage again in the morning. Our starting voltage is 12.66, that's perfect. 24 hours later, we are still at 12.65 volts, so that's perfect. That tells me I don't have any major parasitic drains or problems with the battery holding a charge. If your battery is below 12.5 or worse yet, below 12.4 volts, I would recommend checking out other videos on YouTube on how to check for a parasitic drain, and also taking your car to AutoZone, where they will hook a machine up to your battery and it will test all sorts of things, and they'll give you a full diagnosis on whether or not your battery needs to be replaced. Fast forward in a bit, I got the starter off the car, and we're gonna do two continuity tests on this solenoid. So we're gonna put one lead in this little connector right down in there, and we're gonna take the other one and touch anywhere on the body of the starter. That's good. Next, we're gonna try and test on this little connection point here where this copper wire is supposed to come off of. You can see, not really getting much. This is pretty rusty, pretty corroded. There's a little spot right there I managed to scrape away and get a connection at. But nonetheless, that tells me that the solenoid's good, but perhaps that there's a problem with the electrical circuit and the fact that this is so rusty and corroded that maybe an improper amount of power is making its way to the motor and through the solenoid. If you need to, you can replace just this solenoid right here. It costs about 30 or 40 bucks. Pretty easy to replace. Just remove this rusty nut right there, and then these two nuts over here, and just swap the parts out. You can also replace this rusty wire right here for about 15 to 20 bucks. However, it'd be pretty difficult to replace. These screws are pretty old, rusty, and corroded, so good luck getting that out. Not to mention, you'd be taking a chance that it doesn't fix the problem, and you'd put the part back on the car, then you'd have to take it back off, put another part back on, and that's just a lot of work I'd rather not tamper with. It's already got over 200,000 miles and 17 years of use, and for only 150 bucks, And it's a pretty good deal. To be rest assured that I'm going to get a brand new, proper working starter first try. That's also going to last another 200,000 miles in 17 years. So that's the route I'm going to take. You can choose what is best for your situation. Now we're going to remove this airbox assembly, and we got to remove this electrical connector off the map sensor. And then there are 4 screws we have to remove, 1 on each corner. Here's a little clamp here as well. We have to undo that so we can disconnect it from this tube. The size for this little clamp is 5.5 millimeters. With that loose, now we should be able to remove the airbox, hopefully. Now we have to remove the battery, so we'll start by disconnecting this negative terminal first. There we are. Now we can disconnect the positive terminal. Then we gotta loosen these battery tie downs. And then we can remove the battery, and this one I guess doesn't have a handle, so I'm just gonna have to muscle it out. And then beneath the battery is this little housing. We can remove that too. Then we just have to pop this little clip out, and there's a tiny little 8 millimeter bolt connected to a bracket back here that's also attaching all these wires. We're gonna remove that. And there's another bolt down here we gotta remove. And there's a 10 millimeter back here. And then hopefully this lifts up and out. Now we gotta remove the battery base plate, and we gotta start by removing this little fuse box here, starting with this little bracket bolt. Then we gotta remove this fuse box. Got these little tabs here, just kind of pull it away from the box, and they can kind of lift it up and out. There we go. There's a couple of wires attached to this base plate before we remove the last final bolts. There's one right here, here, and here. One on the left side here. There's that little clip on that green connector. You lift up on that tab, and it should pull off the bracket. We also have another big green clip attached to that wire bundle back there. One more there. And our third green connector is right there. This clip down here is pretty tricky to remove. Basically, you gotta get a little pick tool, and you gotta push in a little tab located on the back side right here. And then you can slide the whole wire assembly forward off this bracket. Now we just have a few bolts to remove. We got one kind of located down here, and 2 more back here and here. And finally, we can remove this battery base plate. With the battery and base plate out, we can next disconnect the 2 electrical connectors attached to the starter. We'll pull back this little rubber sleeve, and we'll remove that nut. And then right to the left is another connector. Just push the little push tab and pull the connector straight out. Now it's time to remove those 2 bolts holding the starter in. It's gonna be a pretty tight squeeze, not a lot of working room, not a lot of visibility. But the first one on top is located right beneath the EGR valve. You can see I currently have my ratchet attached to it. It's a 14 millimeter, by the way, so you can just barely make it out in there. And then the bottom one, you're just gonna have to do by feel. It's on the bottom side of that starter. And I have my tool on that bottom bolt. Again, very tight squeeze. Not a lot of working room. Hopefully this gives you some perspective as far as where it needs to go. Having a little mirror like this can certainly help. You can really see back in there. And let's remove that bottom bolt too. And now that I think about it, there's really no way to pull the starter out through the side. And so what I'm gonna instead try to do is I'm gonna remove this coolant hose bracket right there. And then I'm gonna pull it out through the top in between each of these coolant hoses. Let's just pull this big driver side coolant hose off to the side. Try and grab it and pull it on up and through. Yes, tight squeeze. Come on, there we go. All right, make sure your gasket comes with. I'm Pretty sure it's stuck on the car, but yeah, got it out. Okay, we got our new starter, nice and shiny, nice golden copper, not corroded at all. We're gonna put this bad boy back in, make sure your gasket's nice and flat, and let's get this lined up and put it back in the same way we took it out. And there we are in place. And then we're just gonna very carefully get those screws started, and then we'll torque them down next. And then we can torque these bolts down to 33 foot-pounds. Before we put this terminal back on the starter, I recommend cleaning it up with a wire brush or some sandpaper. Yeah, it's looking a lot better. Then we can put that wire on the starter and torque that little nut down to 7 foot-pounds. Then we can unplug that electrical connector into the starter solenoid as well. Then we can get that little green connector hooked back onto the starter bracket, reconnect our coolant hose clamps, and then we can put the battery base back in. So we'll start with those 4 large bolts down there, and then there's one more hidden back there. And then we got this big electrical connector on the driver's side. Reattach that. We got this fat wire. It has 1 of 3 green connectors and a small little clip there. Then we've got a wire that comes straight down off this battery box. It has a green connector right there. Then we've got this really long positive battery terminal cable. It's got 2 connectors that go through there and there. 1 more there. And our 3rd green connector is right there. Then we can finally take this big old box right here, lift it up, slide it down, and then we can take a 10mm bolt and put it back in that hole. Now we can take this air filter assembly, put it in there, and then tighten down these 2 larger bolts up top. And then in the back, we have this wire bracket and a 2nd wire bracket there as well. And we can put the battery housing as well as the battery back in place, put our battery tie down back on, snug these bolts up so it doesn't move. We can put the air filter housing back on. It's held in by those 4 bolts all the way around. We can put this airflow sensor connector back on and tighten this clamp. And then when you're ready, you can reconnect the battery terminals. Okay, we got that new starter in. It's 31 degrees. Engine is completely cold. We're gonna do a cold start, see if that noise goes away. Perfect, we fixed the problem. You can see it didn't make a single noise at all. And for that matter, it actually cranked a bit faster too, it sounds like. So it was definitely the starter that was the problem. And there you have it, everybody. We fixed our noisy starter. And so I hope you all found this video helpful and insightful. And if you did, why don't you go ahead and like the video? It certainly helps me out a lot. And consider subscribing to the channel as well. We're gonna find a bunch of other videos just like this one showing you how to fix your car. Also check out the description. I'm going to be putting a bunch of other information down there, as well as links to parts, torque specs, timestamps, and whatnot. And also feel free to leave a comment. I'm pretty good at getting back to people. So as always, thanks for watching, have a great day, and take care.